The air was thick with an unnatural chill, the kind that clings to the skin and gnaws at the edges of reason. As Eduardo approached the abandoned cigarette factory, the full moon illuminated the decrepit building like a sinister spotlight, revealing its crumbling brick walls and shattered windows. The structure seemed to breathe, exhaling faint wisps of smoke from nowhere, as if it were alive. Eduardo hesitated at the rusted gates, their jagged edges bent outward like the teeth of some monstrous maw. His camera hung heavy around his neck, a feeble shield against the growing dread that curled in his stomach. As he stepped inside, his boots crunched on shattered glass and debris, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The once bustling factory floor stretched before him, a cavernous expanse bathed in eerie shadows. Moonlight streamed through gaps in the decayed roof, forming pale pools on the concrete floor. Yet the light did little to dispel the darkness, it only seemed to make it more alive. The air carried an acrid tang of burnt tobacco and mildew, mixing with something more foul, something Eduardo couldn't quite place. A cough echoed faintly, startling him. He froze, heart pounding, his breath visible in the icy air. But there was no one there. The silence grew heavier, pressing down like a weight on Eduardo's chest. Then came the sound, a metallic screech that shattered the stillness, the unmistakable whirring of machinery coming to life. His eyes darted toward the source. One of the ancient cigarette rolling machines at the far end of the room had inexplicably started running. The conveyor belt moved sluggishly, as if reluctant to awaken after decades of dormancy. Eduardo took a step back, gripping his camera tightly, his mind racing with possible explanations. Faulty wiring, he whispered to himself, though he knew no electricity had flowed through the factory in years. A sudden movement in the corner of his eye snapped him to attention. He spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark, only to catch the tail end of a shadow slipping into a nearby corridor. The shadow moved unnaturally, as if gliding just out of sync with reality. "Hello," Eduardo called, his voice echoing back, distorted, as if the walls themselves mocked him. His words dissolved into silence, and for a moment, all he could hear was the rapid thumping of his own heartbeat. Summoning his courage, Eduardo followed the shadow into the corridor, the narrow space lined with rusted lockers and decayed posters warning about workplace safety. The smell intensified, a rancid combination of smoke and rot that made his stomach churn. His flashlight flickered, and he slapped it in frustration, the beam dimming just enough to deepen the shadows around him. The deeper he ventured, the more the walls seemed to close in, constricting like the ribs of a giant beast. Faint whispers began to emerge, indecipherable and distant, but unmistakably human, or so he thought. Just as he reached the end of the corridor, Eduardo's foot brushed against something soft. He directed his flashlight downward and recoiled. A cigarette pack, pristine and untouched, lay at his feet. It was impossible. This brand hadn't been produced in decades. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, and the pack felt warm, pulsing faintly as if alive. The whispers grew louder now, surrounding him, a chorus of disembodied voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Eduardo staggered backward, clutching the pack, and bumped into something solid. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with a mannequin dressed in a factory worker's uniform, its glassy eyes staring straight through him. The mannequin hadn't been there before. Eduardo stumbled back, his camera swinging wildly as the mannequin toppled over, shattering into a cloud of ash and smoke. The whispers became a deafening roar, filling his ears with pleas, accusations, and something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. In a panic, Eduardo turned and fled back to the factory floor, his flashlight flickering out entirely. The machines were now all running, their metallic clanking forming a chaotic rhythm that echoed through the cavernous space. Breathing heavily, Eduardo fumbled for his camera and began recording. "This is something else," he muttered, his voice trembling. The factory felt alive, its very walls seeming to pulse with malevolent energy. Desperate for a sense of normalcy, he spoke directly into the camera, forcing a weak smile. "If you're intrigued by what I've found so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Haunted Grounds. I have a feeling this is only the beginning." As the words left his lips, the machines abruptly fell silent, and the factory plunged into a suffocating stillness. A single cough echoed from the shadows, closer this time. Eduardo knew he wasn't alone anymore. As the oppressive silence settled over the factory once more, Eduardo's nerves were frayed, his every sense heightened to the point of agony. He ventured deeper into the building, drawn toward a faint glow emanating from a room at the end of a corridor. The air grew heavier with each step, the acrid stench of smoke thickening until it felt as though his lungs were being coated in ash. When he reached the room, he hesitated, the door creaking ominously as he pushed it open. The glow came from an old rusted desk lamp, inexplicably flickering to life in a room otherwise untouched by time. On the desk sat a single object, a weathered cigar box. The name etched into the lid sent a chill down his spine, Alberto Fontes. His grandfather's name. Eduardo froze, his mind racing. He had only faint memories of the man, a quiet, broken figure who had died coughing up blood when Eduardo was just a child. His family never spoke of him much, only hinting at the years he'd worked in a factory under brutal conditions. Eduardo's fingers trembled as he reached for the box. When he touched it, a sudden burst of images flooded his mind. A dimly lit factory floor, workers coughing violently, their faces obscured by thick clouds of smoke. He recoiled, gasping, but the box wouldn't let go. It seemed to pulse under his fingers, and the faint strains of a melody began to fill the room. A haunting lullaby, soft but chilling, whispered in the air. Eduardo recognized it instantly. It was the same tune his grandfather used to hum during his final days. His heart pounded as he realized the melody wasn't coming from a speaker or any obvious source. It was emanating from the box itself. He forced the lid open, revealing a bundle of old hand-rolled cigarettes, each perfectly preserved despite the passage of time. A faded photograph lay beneath them, showing a group of factory workers standing in front of the building. Eduardo scanned their faces, stopping abruptly when he recognized a younger version of his grandfather among them. The man's expression was grave, his eyes haunted, as though he knew something terrible was coming. Written on the back of the photograph were the words, "The debt must be paid." The air in the room grew colder, and Eduardo felt a presence behind him. He spun around, flashlight in hand, but the beam revealed nothing but peeling wallpaper and shadows. Yet the feeling of being watched was unmistakable, an oppressive weight pressing against his mind. The lullaby grew louder, distorting into a rasping cough that echoed around the room. Eduardo clutched his head as whispers erupted from every corner, voices overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. "Why did you come back? You don't belong here. The debt remains, unpaid." Desperate to escape, Eduardo grabbed the photograph and cigar box, shoving them into his bag. But as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the lamp's light flickering violently before extinguishing completely. He was plunged into darkness, his breath quick and shallow as he fumbled for his flashlight. When it finally flickered on, the room had changed. The walls were now covered in soot, blackened as though a fire had ravaged the space. The desk had vanished, replaced by a pile of ash that emitted faint tendrils of smoke. Eduardo's pulse raced as he tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, converging into a single voice, low, guttural, and filled with malice. "You cannot run from the past." The air seemed to vibrate, the very room warping as the temperature plummeted. Eduardo felt something cold brush against his neck, and when he turned, his flashlight illuminated a shadowy figure in the corner. It was humanoid but distorted, its form flickering like smoke caught in an unseen wind. Its eyes burned with a dull ember-like glow, and it raised a hand, pointing directly at Eduardo. In a panic, Eduardo threw his weight against the door, and it finally gave way, sending him stumbling back into the corridor. He didn't look back, but the whispers followed him, now distant but insistent. As he ran, he realized the lullaby had returned, softer this time, almost mocking. His thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. How was his grandfather connected to this place? Why was his name on the box? And what debt was left unpaid? He stopped in the middle of the factory floor, panting and trembling. Pulling the photograph from his bag, he examined it more closely. His grandfather wasn't just one of the workers. He was standing in the center of the group, a position of authority. Eduardo's eyes caught something else in the background of the photograph, the faint outline of a shadow, identical to the figure he had just seen. It loomed over the group like a specter, a harbinger of doom. Eduardo's thoughts raced. What if his grandfather had known about the horrors of this place? What if he had been complicit in something unspeakable? The factory wasn't just haunted, it was a mausoleum of guilt, a monument to sins long buried but never forgotten. As the whispers began to rise again, Eduardo knew one thing. This wasn't just a search for answers. This was a confrontation with a past that refused to stay dead. Eduardo's breaths came in short, panicked gasps as he stumbled deeper into the factory. The photograph and cigar box weighed heavy in his bag, a constant reminder of the dark connection he now shared with this cursed place. He had to find a way out, but the factory seemed to twist and change around him. Corridors that should have led to exits now stretched endlessly into darkness, while doorways appeared and disappeared like mirages. The factory was alive, its malevolence palpable in every creak of metal and shift of shadow. As he turned a corner, Eduardo found himself in a cavernous room filled with rusted machinery. The machines loomed like skeletal sentinels, their belts and gears coated in a thick layer of soot. In the center of the room stood a massive furnace, its metal doors sealed shut with heavy chains. The air here was different, hot, suffocating, and laced with a metallic tang of blood. Eduardo's flashlight flickered, its beam dimming as the shadows around him seemed to swell and pulse. Then he heard it, a voice, faint at first but growing louder, calling his name. Eduardo. Eduardo, it was a woman's voice, soft and mournful, but laced with a sinister undertone. He froze, scanning the room, but saw no one. The voice continued, and as it did, Eduardo's vision blurred. He felt an overwhelming urge to approach the furnace, as if invisible hands were guiding him. His legs moved against his will, carrying him closer to the chained doors. When he reached the furnace, the voice stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Eduardo reached out to touch the chains, but before his fingers could graze the cold metal, the furnace doors rattled violently, as though something inside was desperate to escape. He stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. A dense cloud of smoke began to seep through the gaps in the doors, twisting and curling into shapes that almost resembled faces. The smoke whispered to him, their voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. "You must decide. The debt must be paid. Free us, or become one of us." Eduardo staggered back, clutching his head as the voices grew louder, pounding against his skull. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The room fell silent, and the chains on the furnace fell away, clattering to the ground. The doors creaked open, revealing an infernal glow within. From the light stepped a figure, a towering shadowy entity with glowing embers for eyes. It radiated a suffocating power, and Eduardo felt his knees buckle under its gaze. The entity spoke, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "You carry the burden of the past," it said. "The sins of the father fall to the son. Choose, Eduardo. Will you cleanse the stain, or will you let it consume you?" As the entity raised an arm, two objects appeared before Eduardo, suspended in midair. One was the photograph of his grandfather, but now the faces of the workers were twisted into expressions of agony. The other was the cigar box, its contents glowing with an unnatural light. The entity's voice thundered again. "Burn the photograph, and the souls of the guilty will be free. But their sins will become yours, and you will carry them forever. Burn the box, and the factory's darkness will fade, but the souls within will be lost for eternity." Eduardo's mind raced as he processed the impossible choice. If he destroyed the photograph, he would save his grandfather's soul and the others trapped in this cursed place. But at what cost to himself? If he destroyed the box, he could end the factory's reign of terror, but he would forever condemn the spirits to their torment. Sweat dripped down his face as he tried to weigh the consequences, his heart pounding like a drum. The furnace roared to life, flames licking at the edges of the open doors, as if urging him to hurry. Eduardo clutched his chest, struggling to breathe as the heat intensified. The shadows around him began to move, taking on the forms of the trapped souls. Their faces were grotesque, their eyes hollow as they reached out to him, begging silently for salvation. Among them he saw his grandfather, his face a mixture of sorrow and resignation. Tears streamed down Eduardo's face as he realized the gravity of his decision. I can't," he stammered, his voice cracking. The shadows screamed, their anguish reverberating through the room as the entity loomed closer. "Choose," it demanded, its voice shaking the walls. The furnace roared louder, the flames climbing higher, threatening to engulf him. Eduardo's hand trembled as he reached into his bag. His fingers brushed against the photograph and the box, their surfaces unnaturally hot. The shadows surged forward, their screams deafening, and Eduardo felt as though he were being torn apart. His mind fractured under the weight of the choice, but deep down, he knew there was no escape. The factory would not let him leave without making a decision. With a final, shuddering breath, Eduardo made his choice. As the object fell into the furnace, the flames erupted in a blinding flash of light, consuming the room in an inferno of fire and smoke. Eduardo's scream joined the cacophony, echoing endlessly into the void. The factory's silence returned, but it was not the silence of peace. It was a silence heavy with anticipation, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Eduardo stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving from the choice he had made. The furnace's fire had vanished, leaving nothing but darkness and the faint smell of burnt paper. Yet the oppressive heat lingered, as if the walls themselves radiated the residual anger of what had just transpired. His flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the thick, almost sentient shadows that swirled around him. The whispers began softly, a delicate murmur like a breeze brushing through leaves, just on the edge of perception. Eduardo's ears strained to catch the words, but they eluded him, shifting and changing like smoke. Then they grew louder, more distinct, each word dripping with malice. "He is ours," one voice hissed. "Run," another warned, but its tone carried no kindness, only mockery. Eduardo turned in circles, the beam of his flashlight darting across the room, but there was no one there. The shadows began to move, slithering along the walls like black serpents, pooling in the corners of the room before darting closer. Eduardo's breath quickened as he backed away, his feet crunching on scattered debris. He felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine as one shadow peeled itself away from the wall, coalescing into a tall humanoid figure. Its form was featureless, a silhouette of pure darkness, but its presence was suffocating. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, as if studying him, and then it spoke, not with a voice, but directly into his mind. "You should not have come here." Eduardo stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The shadow figure dissolved into tendrils of smoke, which darted toward him, wrapping around his legs. He kicked and swatted at the smoke, but it was like trying to fight the air. The whispers grew louder, multiplying into a cacophony that drowned out his frantic thoughts. Desperate, Eduardo sprinted toward the nearest door, but as he reached it, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire building. The shadows followed, creeping under the door and pooling around his feet, as if waiting for him to make another move. From the darkness, a new sound emerged, a rhythmic tapping, faint but deliberate. It echoed through the room, growing louder with each passing second. Eduardo froze, his hands trembling as he shone his flashlight toward the source. The light landed on an old office chair in the corner, its wheels rusted and immobile. The chair was spinning slowly, impossibly, as if an unseen force was toying with it. On the desk beside the chair lay a stack of unmarked cigarette packs, each one pristine despite the decay around it. The tapping continued, and Eduardo realized it was coming from the desk, a single cigarette rolling back and forth on its own. His heart felt like it might burst from his chest as the cigarette came to a stop. The tapping ceased, and for a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, out of nowhere, the chair shot across the room with a deafening screech, slamming into the wall with enough force to shatter the wooden frame. Eduardo screamed, spinning around to find himself face to face with another shadow figure, this one larger and more defined. Its eyes burned like embers, and its elongated fingers reached toward him. The whispers erupted into laughter, mocking, cruel, and full of malice. The figure's voice pierced through the noise, low and guttural. "You carry his sins," it said, its words dripping with venom. "The factory knows you. It remembers you." Eduardo shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but the figure only leaned closer, its ember-like eyes flaring brighter. "Lies," it hissed. "You are one of us now." The shadows around him surged, wrapping around his arms and legs, dragging him to the center of the room. Eduardo struggled, but the smoke was cold and relentless, sapping his strength. He felt the air grow colder, his breath visible in short, panicked puffs. Above him, the ceiling seemed to dissolve, revealing a swirling void of black smoke and faint, ghostly faces. The faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Eduardo recognized one of them. It was his grandfather. The sight paralyzed him with a mixture of fear and sorrow. Suddenly, the whispers changed. They became clearer, sharper, like blades slicing through his thoughts. "You have one chance," they said in unison. The shadows loosened their grip, and Eduardo collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. When he looked up, he saw a single pack of cigarettes lying in front of him, its edges glowing faintly. The ember-eyed figure loomed over it, its shadowy form undulating like smoke in a breeze. "Take it," the figure commanded. "Accept your place, and we will spare you." Eduardo's hands shook as he reached for the pack, his mind racing. He didn't trust the entity, but the alternative, whatever it might be, felt far worse. The whispers grew softer, almost pleading, as he hesitated. His fingers hovered over the pack, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. As he glanced back at the swirling void above, The faces of the damned seemed to watch him, their expressions shifting between despair and anger. "Choose wisely," the shadow figure intoned, its voice echoing through the factory like a death knell. Eduardo's hand closed around the cigarette pack, and the world erupted into chaos. The shadows surged, the whispers became screams, and the floor beneath him cracked open, revealing nothing but endless darkness. The factory roared with malevolent glee as Eduardo's mind spiraled into terror. The pack in his hand grew hot, burning his palm, and the ember-eyed figure let out a laugh that echoed endlessly in his ears. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. Eduardo found himself alone, the pack of cigarettes still clutched in his trembling hand. The factory was silent once more, but the shadows lingered, watching, waiting. He knew now that he had crossed a line, that whatever haunted this place had claimed a part of him. And no matter what he did, it would never let him go. Eduardo's mind swirled with fragmented thoughts as he clutched the pack of cigarettes in his trembling hand. The factory seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, each beat synchronized with the frantic pounding of his heart. The shadows clung to him like living things, whispering just out of earshot, their words tangled and sinister. His breathing grew ragged as the world around him began to distort, the walls stretched and contracted, the machines groaned as though alive, and the air became suffocatingly thick with the stench of burnt tobacco and decay. He stumbled forward, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere, but every step felt like wading through molasses. The factory seemed intent on holding him in place, its darkness weaving an invisible net around him. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance, drawing Eduardo like a moth to a flame. The light was weak and erratic, its source hidden behind a maze of rusted machinery, but it offered a fleeting promise of reprieve from the suffocating gloom. As Eduardo approached, the whispers grew louder, taking on a mocking tone. "Do you think you can escape?" one hissed. "We see your fear," another taunted. The air around him grew colder, and with each step, he felt as though unseen hands were brushing against his arms and legs, their icy touch sending shivers down his spine. He reached the source of the light, a small flickering lantern that rested atop an old wooden table. Next to the lantern lay a cracked mirror, its surface fogged and smeared with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Curiosity and dread warred within Eduardo as he stared at the mirror. Something about it felt wrong, as though it were alive and waiting for him to make the first move. Against his better judgment, he wiped the surface clean with a shaking hand. The reflection that stared back at him was not his own. It was distorted, twisted, his eyes sunken, his face gaunt, and his mouth pulled into an unnatural grin. The figure in the mirror raised its hand, beckoning Eduardo closer. He stumbled back, but the reflection remained unchanged, its grin widening into something impossibly grotesque. "Look closer," the whispers urged, their voices weaving into his thoughts like threads of poison. The lantern flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Eduardo felt his will slipping, his fear twisting into a perverse curiosity. He leaned forward, his breath fogging the surface of the mirror. As his eyes locked onto the distorted reflection, the grin on its face disappeared. The reflection mouthed a single word: "Run." Before Eduardo could react, the mirror cracked violently, shards flying outward with a deafening shatter. The lantern extinguished, plunging the room into complete darkness. Panic gripped him as the whispers erupted into a cacophony of laughter and screams. He stumbled away from the table, his flashlight sputtering to life just long enough to reveal something horrifying. His reflection was no longer confined to the mirror. It stood before him, fully formed, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Eduardo froze, his mind screaming at him to move, but his body refused to obey. The reflection tilted its head, mimicking the earlier gesture of the shadow figure, and then lunged toward him with impossible speed. He fell backward, his flashlight clattering to the ground, its beam spinning wildly. The reflection dissolved into smoke mid-leap, swirling around him like a predatory fog. The whispers returned, but now they spoke directly into his ears, their words sharp and cutting. "Your fear feeds us. Every step you take is ours. You belong here." The smoke tightened around him, and Eduardo gasped for air, clawing at the invisible force constricting his chest. His mind flooded with visions, his grandfather coughing up blood in a dimly lit room, shadowy figures watching from the corners, the sound of machines grinding endlessly. He saw himself trapped in the factory forever, his face twisted into the same grotesque grin that had stared back at him in the mirror. Then the whispers shifted, their tones softening into something almost soothing. "It doesn't have to be this way," they murmured. A new vision emerged, Eduardo walking free from the factory, the sunlight warm on his face, his bag heavy with answers and closure. The whispers offered him a deal. Surrender your fear, and we will let you go. Eduardo hesitated, the temptation gnawing at him. Could he trust these voices, these entities that thrived on his terror? What would surrendering mean? The smoke loosened its grip slightly, as though coaxing him to accept. The whispers became sweeter, almost melodic, promising release, clarity, and freedom. His fingers brushed against the pack of cigarettes in his pocket, its presence grounding him in the moment. He remembered the faces of the trapped souls, their silent screams etched into his memory. "No," Eduardo whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. The whispers hissed in anger, the smoke tightening around him again. His fear surged, but so did his determination. He clutched the flashlight and slammed it against the ground, the impact sparking a brief but brilliant flash of light. The smoke recoiled with a guttural scream, retreating into the shadows. Eduardo scrambled to his feet, his legs shaky but determined. The factory seemed to roar with fury, its walls groaning and its floors trembling. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, but Eduardo ignored them, his focus solely on moving forward. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing: he would not let his fear consume him. Not here. Not now. Not ever. The factory's fury grew with each step Eduardo took, the air vibrating with a palpable rage as if the building itself sought to crush him. The walls groaned, metal creaked, and the shadows twisted violently, their tendrils reaching for him but recoiling when met with the faint beam of his flickering flashlight. Eduardo knew he was running out of time. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a low guttural hum that reverberated through his bones. A warning, a promise, a threat. He stumbled into a vast, circular chamber, its size exaggerated by the oppressive darkness. In the center stood a massive, rusted machine, its design alien and grotesque. It looked like a hybrid of factory equipment and something otherworldly, with pipes that snaked up into the darkness above and gears that seemed to move of their own accord, dripping with a black, viscous liquid. Eduardo's flashlight wavered over the machine, and his heart sank as he noticed something even more disturbing. Faces, human faces, emerging from the metal, their expressions frozen in anguish. The machine exhaled a hiss of steam, the sound almost human, as if it were alive and suffering. Eduardo's grip on his flashlight tightened as he felt the room closing in around him. The guttural hum grew louder, and from the darkness emerged the shadowy figure with ember-like eyes. This time, it was not alone. Dozens of smaller shadows appeared, their forms flickering and unstable, but their presence undeniable. They surrounded Eduardo, their hollow gazes fixed on him, waiting. The ember-eyed figure stepped forward, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very ground. "You were warned," it said. "You were given a choice, and yet you linger." Its hand, long and clawed, pointed toward the machine. The debt must be paid. Eduardo felt his throat tighten as he stared at the monstrous contraption. The faces within the machine began to move, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. The pipes emitted a wet gurgle, and the black liquid that dripped from them pooled on the floor, creeping toward Eduardo like a living thing. He stepped back, his mind racing. "I didn't ask for this," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "This isn't my debt." The shadow figure tilted its head, and the smaller shadows whispered in unison, their voices layered and haunting. "The sins of the past are yours to bear. Blood binds you to this place." Before Eduardo could respond, the ember-eyed figure raised its arm, and the machine roared to life. Gears churned, steam hissed, and the faces in the metal screamed audibly now, their cries piercing and filled with despair. Eduardo fell to his knees, clutching his head as the sound threatened to split his skull. The shadows closed in around him, their forms growing darker and more solid, until they felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. A sudden blinding pain shot through Eduardo's mind, and his vision blurred. Flashes of memories not his own flooded his consciousness. Workers coughing blood, collapsing beside the very machine that now loomed before him. Shadowy figures dragging bodies into the furnace. His grandfather's face, pale and hollow, as he begged for forgiveness. The visions twisted and melded with his own memories, and Eduardo realized the horrifying truth. His grandfather had been more than a victim of this factory. He had been a part of its darkness, a cog in the monstrous machine that fed on the lives of others. The ember-eyed figure stepped closer, its voice softer but no less menacing. "You cannot escape your bloodline. The factory knows. The factory remembers." Eduardo's mind screamed for an escape, but his body remained frozen, trapped by the weight of the shadows and the crushing guilt that now consumed him. The machine roared louder, its gears grinding as if impatient. The black liquid pooled around Eduardo's feet, its touch icy and invasive, seeping into his shoes and crawling up his legs. It felt alive, hungry, and Eduardo knew it was trying to claim him. Desperate, he reached into his bag and pulled out the pack of cigarettes and the photograph of his grandfather. They felt impossibly heavy, as if they carried the weight of every soul lost to this cursed place. The ember-eyed figure tilted its head again, its gaze fixed on the objects in Eduardo's trembling hands. "Choose," it commanded. "Sacrifice one to free the other. Or remain here, with us forever." The room fell deathly silent, the machine's roaring reduced to a low, menacing rumble as it awaited Eduardo's decision. He looked at the photograph, the image of his grandfather now warped and twisted, the man's eyes pleading for release. Then he looked at the cigarette pack, its edges glowing faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. The shadows hissed around him, their voices a mix of urgency and malice. "Choose. Choose. Choose." Tears streamed down Eduardo's face as he struggled to make sense of it all. Was there truly a way to end this nightmare? Could he trust the promises of these malevolent entities? His mind raced with the consequences of each choice. If he burned the photograph, he would save the souls trapped here, including his grandfather's, but at what cost to himself? If he burned the cigarette pack, he might destroy the factory's power, but the souls within would be lost forever. The ember-eyed figure leaned closer, its presence overwhelming. "Time is fleeting, Eduardo. The factory hungers." With a shuddering breath, Eduardo closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry." He dropped one of the objects into the pool of black liquid at his feet. The reaction was immediate. Screams erupted from every corner of the room, the shadows writhing in agony as the machine let out a deafening roar. The black liquid surged upward, engulfing Eduardo as the room exploded in a blinding light. When Eduardo opened his eyes, he was lying on the cold, cracked floor of the factory. The light that had engulfed him moments before had vanished, replaced by a suffocating darkness. The machine in the center of the room had fallen silent, its gears frozen, its pipes leaking faint trails of black smoke that dissipated into the void above. Eduardo sat up, his body aching, and immediately noticed the heavy stillness in the air. The whispers, the shadows, the malevolent presence, they were gone. But the ember-eyed figure remained. It stood at the edge of the room, its towering form now more defined, its shape almost human yet entirely unnatural. Its ember eyes burned brighter, piercing through the darkness with an intensity that made Eduardo's skin crawl. The entity seemed smaller now, weaker, but its malice was undiminished. Eduardo tried to stand, his legs trembling beneath him, as the figure stepped closer. "You think this is over?" it said, its voice now sharper, more cutting. "You believe you've won?" Eduardo clenched his fists, the weight of his choice pressing heavily on him. The object he had sacrificed, whether the photograph or the cigarette pack, was no longer with him, and he couldn't tell if the factory felt lighter or heavier without it. He looked at the ember-eyed figure, his fear boiling into a mix of anger and defiance. "I've done what you asked," he said, his voice shaking. "Let me go." The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. "You misunderstand," it hissed. "You were never meant to leave. You are part of this place now. Your blood ties you to its darkness, and your soul is ours." The shadows around the room began to stir again, faint tendrils creeping toward Eduardo. He stepped back instinctively, but the figure raised a hand, and the shadows stopped, writhing in place like serpents waiting for their master's command. "But I offer you one last choice," the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. "Face what lies ahead, and prove your worth. Or fall to the shadows, and join the others." Before Eduardo could respond, the ground beneath him trembled violently, and the room began to change. The walls melted away into a swirling void, revealing a vast expanse of darkness punctuated by faint, glowing embers. The air grew colder, and Eduardo's breath fogged as he looked around, trying to make sense of the surreal, ever-shifting space. The figure stood at the center of it all, its ember eyes fixed on him, its form glowing faintly in the blackness. "Step forward," it commanded. "Face the truth." Eduardo hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The void stretched endlessly in every direction, and the shadows loomed behind him, their movements growing more aggressive. Summoning what little courage he had left, Eduardo stepped forward, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the emptiness. The ember-eyed figure gestured toward a swirling mass of smoke that began to take shape before him. As Eduardo watched, The smoke solidified into a horrifying vision. The factory, alive and thriving, its machines churning endlessly as workers labored under a cloud of thick, suffocating smoke. He saw men and women coughing, collapsing, their bodies dragged away by unseen forces. At the center of it all stood his grandfather, overseeing the operation with a grim expression. Eduardo's heart sank as he realized the truth. His grandfather had been more than a victim. He had been a willing participant, a cog in the factory's machinery, complicit in its horrors. "No," Eduardo whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's not true. He wouldn't." The ember-eyed figure let out a low, guttural laugh. "The sins of the father," it said, its voice echoing in the void. "Passed down, generation after generation. This place thrives on their guilt, their fear, their blood. And now it thrives on you." The vision shifted, and Eduardo saw himself in the factory, his reflection twisted and hollow, just as it had appeared in the shattered mirror. He was standing at the center of the room, surrounded by the same shadowy figures that now encircled him. Their whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the void pressed in around him. "You cannot escape," the shadows hissed. "You are one of us." Eduardo dropped to his knees, his mind reeling. The weight of the factory's darkness bore down on him, threatening to crush what little resolve he had left. But as the shadows closed in, a faint light appeared in the distance, a flickering, fragile glow that cut through the void like a blade. Eduardo focused on it, his fear giving way to a flicker of hope. He pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling, and began to move toward the light. The ember-eyed figure roared in anger, its form swelling with rage. "You cannot defy us," it bellowed. The shadows surged forward, their tendrils lashing out, but Eduardo kept moving, his eyes fixed on the light. The closer he got, the stronger the glow became, pushing back the darkness and the shadows with a warmth that felt almost familiar. As he reached the light, Eduardo saw what it was, a small glowing ember, hovering in the void. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, its glow steady and calming. Without thinking, he reached out and touched it. The ember flared brightly, and the void around him exploded in a blinding light. When the light faded, Eduardo found himself standing outside the factory. The night was quiet, the air crisp and clean, with no sign of the oppressive darkness that had consumed him moments before. He turned to look at the building, its silhouette looming against the moonlit sky. For a moment, it seemed peaceful, as though the darkness within had finally been laid to rest. But as Eduardo turned to leave, he heard a faint whisper, carried on the wind, "We are not done." He stopped, his heart racing, but the whisper faded into the night. Shaking his head, he began to walk away, the weight of his experience pressing heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know if the factory's darkness had truly been vanquished, or if it was merely waiting, for him or for someone else. One thing was certain, the shadows of the factory would haunt him forever. Eduardo walked away from the factory, his body heavy with exhaustion, his mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions and lingering dread. The oppressive darkness of the night seemed to cling to him, even under the pale light of the moon. Every step he took felt like an act of defiance against the unseen forces that had tried to claim him. Yet, as he distanced himself from the cursed place, the whispers that had haunted him inside began to stir faintly in the back of his mind, as if they were embedded in his very thoughts. He stopped at the edge of the factory's crumbling gates, glancing back one final time. The building stood silent and foreboding, its broken windows like empty eyes watching him leave. The faint tendrils of smoke still curled from the roof, though there were no fires burning inside. Eduardo's fingers tightened around the strap of his camera bag, his knuckles white. He had survived, but at what cost? The factory felt unfinished, as though its grip on him wasn't entirely severed. From deep within the factory, Eduardo thought he heard something, a cough, faint and distant. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Was it his imagination, or was it real? The sound echoed softly, growing quieter until it faded completely. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. Eduardo shivered, a chill creeping down his spine as if the factory were bidding him farewell, or warning him to never return. He opened his bag and pulled out his camera. The screen flickered to life, displaying the photographs he had taken inside. His hands trembled as he scrolled through them. At first, they seemed normal, empty hallways, decayed machinery, faint beams of moonlight breaking through cracks in the walls. But as he looked closer, his stomach turned. In each image, faint shadows stood where there had been none. Their forms were vague but unmistakable, figures with hollow eyes and twisted expressions. In one photo, He saw the ember-eyed figure staring directly at the lens, its gaze piercing even through the screen. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. His heart raced as he scrolled further, hoping the next image would provide clarity or comfort. Instead, he found a photograph that hadn't been there before. It showed him, standing in the center of the factory's main hall, surrounded by shadows. His face was distorted, his eyes dark and empty, his expression frozen in a grimace of fear. Eduardo's breath quickened as he stared at the impossible image. He didn't remember anyone taking this picture. He didn't remember standing like that. A new fear gripped him, colder and deeper than anything he had felt inside the factory. Was this a warning? A reflection of what could have been, or what still might be? The camera screen flickered again, and the photograph disappeared, replaced by static. Eduardo turned it off and shoved it back into his bag, his hands shaking. He needed to get as far from this place as possible. As he turned to leave, he noticed something glinting faintly on the ground near the gate. He hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to ignore it and keep walking, but curiosity got the better of him. Kneeling down, he picked up the object, a cigarette, pristine and untouched, its paper gleaming faintly in the moonlight. A chill ran through him as he recognized it. It was identical to the ones in the cigar box he had sacrificed. His grip tightened, his pulse pounding in his ears. The factory had left him a parting gift, a reminder that its reach extended far beyond its walls. Eduardo stuffed the cigarette into his pocket, his steps quickening as he moved away from the factory. The road ahead stretched into the darkness, illuminated only by the dim light of the moon. The world felt eerily quiet, as though holding its breath in anticipation. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind, made him flinch. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the factory's shadows still followed him, lurking just out of sight. As the factory disappeared from view, Eduardo tried to steady his breathing. He had survived something no one else might believe, and though he was free, he knew he wasn't entirely safe. The factory had marked him, and its darkness had seeped into his life like smoke through a crack in the wall. Looking directly into the camera strapped to his chest, Eduardo forced a weak, shaky smile and spoke to his future audience. If you've made it this far, you know this story isn't over. The factory's secrets remain, its darkness waiting for someone else to uncover. But take my advice, don't go looking for it. Not unless you're ready to face what's inside. He paused, glancing back toward the invisible silhouette of the factory behind him. His expression darkened, his voice steady but heavy with warning. Like, comment, and share if you want to hear more stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe to Haunted Grounds. You never know, this might not be the last time you hear about the factory. As Eduardo walked away, his shadow stretched unnaturally long under the faint moonlight, almost as if something was holding onto it. Behind him, far in the distance, the faint glow of the factory's ember eyes flickered briefly before disappearing into the night. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but Eduardo couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far he went, the factory would always be waiting. If you liked this story, like the video, share with your friends and subscribe to the Haunted Grounds channel. Until the next nightmare.